Hey everybody. So welcome to coming and checking out the draw over and paint over critiques. I've already selected the artist for today's sessions, but if you go to my Instagram, that's Art Samich or at Art Samich, there's a place here where you can sign up, and I'll be selecting a few more people if you do sign up there for possibly a couple of other one-on-one meetings where I go over portfolio or do draw over critique. So we'll be likely doing that tomorrow or the next day. So if anybody who's getting here a little bit late wants to be able to check that out, then that'll give you a chance to get your stuff critiqued as well. So I'm going to start off with this one for fur. And what I'm going to do is we'll just talk a little bit about this and what your goals were and why I'm going to go the direction that I'm going. And I want to talk a little bit about just the purpose of character design according to my philosophy, which I know it's not the be all end all of what character design is all about. But I think I'm a big believer in purpose driven character design where your characters are all intended to achieve a purpose, and every decision that you make on that purpose or on that character is directed to that purpose. And you've got a lot of things here that are super interesting, like you've got this sort of biopunk rococo sort of mixture, which really makes it unique and interesting. But there's a couple of combinations of those elements that I think are kind of making it hold back. So here's one that I think is especially effective. Big fan of that one. I think that one's just like it really, for me, has this. There's the game-like aggressiveness, which I'm a big believer in. That games, for the most part, we play games because we want to expand our ability to do things. We want to have the freedom to make choices, stuff like that. And characters that kind of exemplify that ideal are really great. I think there's a couple others that I think are really solid for that as well. I particularly like this one as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that one in the critique. But some of the confusing things that I was talking about, oh, actually, let's go back to this one because I think this one is also really good from a purpose-driven standpoint. So you said this is a gambling game, and you have this guy kind of flipping these chips up in the air. You've got these sort of sleeves which feel like they're kind of a place where you would keep stuff under the sleeve, which is interesting as well. I like the high collar and the sort of hat suggestion. The character really feels to me like something I would expect to be sitting at a poker table or whatever. And I don't feel like the biopunk or the rococo things are distracting from what the character is all about. I actually feel like they all feed together really nicely. Some of the things that I think are confusing, like, I look at this one and that's a fun character, but I don't feel like that's a character for a gambling game. We have this big kind of rocket pack thing going on in the dress, and then of course these, you said that they're all about controlling, and I think like controlling that functionality, but that would be, to my mind, kind of a way of controlling the way that you would travel in the game. If it was a game where you're moving off of platforms and you want to be able to move out of there quickly, then I think those decisions really make sense. And maybe there's a way to tie those abilities or those things to the gambling concept that these are based around. But right now, I'm feeling this kind of like rocket up in the air and then float down with this funny, floofy parachute hat thing. This character is all about poking people in the eyes, right? So hopefully you can see what it is that I'm talking about when I say purpose-driven design. It's like this decision of putting those sort of like root things up over this guy's head. They're interesting, but I think it kind of stops there. I don't understand the purpose. It kind of looks like it's just something he just sat on there rather than it being a critical part of his armor, what he does, anything like that. And of course, how it relates to gambling is a big question. So to illustrate this point, I'm going to spend just a little time with this character, but we'll do it on a sheet all by herself. So one of the things I really like about this one is this sort of like big brain coil thing that's going on up here. I imagine this is a character that is very intelligent, and that sort of like big head feature is really supplementing those brains and stuff like that. So I think that's really cool, and I really like the attitude and stuff here. Some of the things that I think are a little bit confusing about that is I don't know what these shoulder things have to do with it. I kind of wish that if I were designing this, I would think of something that perhaps either integrates into the costume in such a way that it just feels like it's a natural part of the dress, so that my brain can say, okay, it's just part of her costume, fine. But they look like they're supposed to do something. And so maybe there's some way that you could connect these up and make them part of this kind of master intelligence thing. It's pulling power from the rest of her body and diverting it to her brain, that sort of thing, right? Um, Actually, let me swap out my brush here real quick because I want to just sketch on this and it'll be easier to see. So another thing I think could be improved with this one is the gesture. So the gesture meaning the pose and the expression. I really like the kind of confident, sassy thing that's going with the hand and the sort of twisted things that are going on with the angles through the fingers. I feel like the eyes and face are maybe not contributing to this kind of twisted mastermind feeling that the rest of the design is giving. And so maybe what I'm thinking, since the head looks like it's kind of turned that way slightly, maybe just pulling those eyes a little bit off to one side so it looks like the character is kind of flitting around and looking at everything, calculating how to get on top of the situation, stuff like that. Let me undo that real quick. Photoshop with streaming don't want to get along right now, so we get some weirdnesses happening. Anyway, so what I'm going to do here to push this idea a little bit better is I'm going to make it so the eyes still have some of the openness that you're getting, but I think maybe the brows, maybe dropping them a little bit more, pulling the eyes over a little bit and getting that kind of searching the room, kind of thinking through every problem. I think those sort of like large, baleful eyes work really well for a character that's kind of thinking their way through the situation. And then this is the other thing that really catches my eye that I think like you should probably make that more purpose driven rather than just being a randomized element. I think all this stuff supports kind of the story you've got. I think those are all fine. So let me just make a suggestion on maybe this element. And I think this thing, the braid that thing goes through, or the braid going through the buckle is also a little bit weird. So what I'd recommend here is maybe you could make it so that these are part of the same assembly, either connecting these parts together somehow, or my instinct tells me that it would make the most sense just to have this stuff be part of the dress. So in this case, I think you could probably get away with the sort of clothing and the biopunk elements that you're getting, but maybe you just have the cloth go over the top, because part of the reason why that's drawing so much attention is because you're getting the white on the other color. It just feels like there's a lot of visual contrast there, and so by reducing that contrast you end up redirecting the attention to where it needs to be, where this character is kind of all about the thinking. So anyway, to my mind, this character feels super close, and I think the one other thing that I might throw in there, and I actually think this is true probably for a lot of these, is maybe something that's akin to what we're seeing here, where we get this guy flipping the chips up in the air. Maybe she's like, secretly keeping some cards stashed behind her fan or something. Potentially you have, this guy's got the little like dice thing, which I think is suggesting a similar sort of thing. Whoa, I lost my pan there. Yeah, so that dice thing kind of peeking out under there works pretty well. This character potentially like if you could get a little bit of a like, working some coins or something between the fingers, or some chips or some dice or something, flipping them around. I think that pushes the intelligence of this character. This one, I think the gesture may need to change more dramatically to make it work. I get the like joyful personality. I think that works, but again, I'm seeing action game here more than anything else. So with this one, I think my biggest thing is on this one. I get the other decisions, but the fingers seem more confusing than not. I don't know if there's like a gambling element that you could reference with the shapes of those, the tips of those fingers or something, so it feels a little bit less like an attack thing and more like something that manipulates the game or something like that. That's kind of my main feeling out of those. Let's talk about this guy and kind of what to do with this. I think that there's two potential things that you could improve on here, and the one is actually just to use this sort of like root system as a way of improving the character, just the story of the character and what the character is all about. So, for example, if this felt like it was part of his like regal dress, and we just look at that thing and it's like that guy's just carrying a throne around him with him everywhere he goes, then that really makes sense. That's pretty cool. Or potentially you could make it so that it feels more like it's something that he's going to do. If you had it so that these felt a little bit more like active elements, like arms that are going to reach down and grab and control things and stuff. You get a sense of a character that can just shuffle a ton of things around all at once. I think that would also work. That would probably be closer to the look that you've already got going on, but I think either solution would really work just fine there. So let me go back to this one since we got just a few more minutes, and I'm going to push this face and gesture a tiny bit further to keep the focus kind of where I think it needs to be in terms of making this character work. So I really like the way that you've got the hair draped down over the face, and I think that echoes really nicely. Whoa, lost something there. We'll find it in a minute. Got some strange artifacts now. Maybe that's better. Okay, so yeah, the way that this thing just kind of is strapped into the head and the way that the hair wraps around there, I'm almost getting I don't know if you've ever read a Christmas Carol or seen it, like Jacob Marley, and the way that um, his chin is kind of being strapped up by something. I think that's a really cool element, and I think to me it almost feels like this. It's like she's super smart, but like it's taking too much out of the character. It's making it so that the character can't accommodate or can't. What's the word I'm looking for? It's like it's not normal. It's not a natural state to have this much brain power, and she's having to like back it up with other things. I really like these sort of like Frankenstein bolts that you have going on. I think those are great, and I think they frame the head nicely. So I would keep all that stuff like it is, and probably all this stuff up here works as well. The one thing I would do, because it's all about the brain, is I would redirect all of the shapes through these areas to focus our attention back into the brain. So even if you went with the option that I mentioned of making this an element of the dress, I would actually try to get that flow pushing us back up towards that brain assembly and that idea of how you think through the character. Now, it's entirely possible that I've misread this character and what your intentions were, but I hope the principle of kind of the purpose-driven design is still going to be useful no matter which way you go with it. I think I would probably put those behind now that I look at this. So I'd shift those back just a tiny bit more and make the foreground element go in front of that. And then this is kind of connecting in behind the brain. Maybe use the arcs to turn so that it feels like it's coming back and then toward us again. In fact, I think it probably wouldn't hurt to even have an extra set of something that goes up a little bit higher. So to my mind, I think those are the biggest things with this character. I think that's what's going to improve it the most. I guess I have a second to take any questions on that specific one. So we'll see if there's any questions, comments on that. Maybe we'll come back to that in just a second. I'll set up for the next critique. Yeah, I'm not seeing any comments or questions, so we'll move on. All right, so with this, Joanna, I think we talked about a couple of these pieces and kind of the environment design sort of stuff. So, and I really like the appeal, particularly of this environment. This one is super cool. I think, there's some stuff that you were talking about that would probably improve this one, but what I'll do is I'll focus on a single image to kind of push that idea further. So So there's a question in the chat which I think is a really good one, which is can you get so purpose driven where you become cheesy? And I think that's a great question. Personally, I think if your purpose is properly defined, in other words, if you have the correct purpose in mind, then you actually can't get too purpose driven. When you the issue, the point where it becomes cheesy, or the point where it becomes that the character's stale and boring, means that you have not discovered the entirety of what that character's purpose is, the role that they fill in the world, what they're supposed to do to audiences when they play as that character or look at that character. So that, I'd say that would be how I would address that concern. If you're running into a problem where the character's meeting the purpose, but the result is bad, it means that you have not properly defined your purpose. Okay, so moving on now to this one, I'm going to switch out for a painting brush, and we're going to work really quickly with this one. You mentioned that you really liked some of the qualities that this painting had, and you wished that you could get that into the backgrounds that you're doing. And one of the things I'm seeing about this one is really great control of edges, and the lighting has a really nice smoky sort of quality to it. So let's see if we can get some of that smoky quality to the lighting, and we're going to play a little bit with the edges as well. So first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at the light here, and it feels like you have light that's spreading out here, which suggests maybe like a spotlight, like a night scene or something, but the lighting looks more like a day scene. I'm going to light it as though it's a day scene, just going with the overall feeling rather than the night feeling, because I think we can do more with the day thing anyway. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to maybe create a multiply layer, and I'm going to bring some warm shadows in here, and I'm going to let the shadows just get a little bit longer and a little bit darker. I think I'm going to swap these out for soft shadows in a minute, but I want to start with the harder shadows, and we'll just make sure that all this stuff, keep running into these weird artifacts. And I don't know if you guys are seeing it on your end, but if the screen goes blank or whatever for a second, I'll try and reset the image so that you can see what's going on. So I'm doing kind of long shadows underneath these, and there's multiple reasons for this. One is to match the light angle, but the other one is to add just a touch of moodiness to the scene by stretching these shadows out, by making it so that they're doing a little bit more. I think the image is just going to get way more interesting, and it's going to get some of that kind of interesting quality that you were getting in that other painting as well. So slightly longer shadows in general are going to increase your, sorry, got that weird artifact again. They're going to generally increase the sort of moodiness of the scene. They're going to increase the sense of drama, I guess is another way of putting that. And since the light is coming from overhead, but I'm going to go for shadows that are a little bit longer, but I'm also going to make them soft shadows. What that means in terms of lighting is that this can't be the sun coming down. So the way that I light this scene, it's going to be more like the skylight coming down through an alley. Maybe the sun is bouncing off a big part of the building up high in the alley or something like that, and it's causing this diffused lighting to come down. We get this really, really soft sort of thing happening. So there's a bunch of questions in the chat. I'll try to get to them in a minute when I have addressed a couple more things on this painting specifically. You'll notice that some of these downward facing surfaces I'm letting get darker as well. This is a pretty common way of handling lighting or adjusting things that I'll do, where I'll paint the shadows farther than I really want them, and then I'll go back in with the eraser and soften things up again. I find that I have the most control over doing it that way, and I can use kind of the sharp edges of the brush to control it. I know I'm being super lazy in this place, in this case with the softness of the brush, but we got 15 minutes to critique this, so I got to go faster than usual. And I'm just going to maybe take some of these upward facing planes and get a touch more shadow on those as well. There's a few things that you can do with soft shadows that'll improve this piece, but I'd say the biggest one is for sure going to be how you handle um, the lighting direction and how the lighting direction is affected by that light. Even if you're not going with a fully rendered look, which it looks like you weren't in this case, it may be helpful to just um, try to find a way to get gradients in there a little bit more, because those gradients give you that moodiness and interest that you're looking for. And I think I'll go a little longer with this top shadow. Now this stuff here, I imagine that will also be soft, but we won't get to that stuff just because there's not enough time in the critique. But I will soften these transitions because I think it's important to sell the idea that this is a soft light. So we're going to get big broad gradients here. Now if this is a window, it'll get a little bit of light on the glass, but not nearly as much as what you've got. So that's going to behave a bit differently from what you've done. Oh, and we got to get nice long soft shadows under these as well. So hopefully you're already seeing a little bit of that kind of moodiness that I was going for. I think there's a lot more kind of spreading out of that light that I'm probably not going to do, because what I want to do is start introducing into this some of the value control that you had in this piece, which I think is really nice. And for me, I think there's two ways of controlling the values so that you get some of those smoky edges that you're handling, and the soft quality of the light we're already getting, but the sort of lost and found edges that you're doing. I think we could do, of course, some local color shifts, but it seems like, to my mind, that the easiest way of handling it is probably going to be to add some atmosphere. So I'm going to do a lighten layer here. Lighten layers are great for atmosphere. And I'm just going to make it so that maybe there's just some soft haze that's kind of settling at the bottom of this alleyway. And what I can do is I can just really control where that light is, where the atmosphere is affecting things in the light, and essentially lose some of these edges just as a result of what that atmosphere is doing. And because it's kind of a low-lying atmosphere, like dust that was kicked up by something that ran through here, or by, maybe just like the work of the day, there's construction going on nearby, whatever, we can be very careful in the way we control that light as it passes through here. And then we can also, with the shadows, blend and unify some of these colors, and that'll also give you some control. So for example, if this whole area starts to blend together in the shadows, then you can really focus our eye where it needs to go, our collective eye. I know we don't have a collective eye, it just sounded funny to my ears suddenly. So yeah, your eye and my eye hopefully will be directed towards the stuff that it needs to be directed to, if we can get this kind of softer quality to the light, but also maybe unify some of these local colors through these parts. The other thing with atmosphere is you can refine the shadows where you need them. You can toss in a shadow if you want something to kind of stand out again, but you don't need to do it everywhere. And I think in this case I'm going to downplay this a little bit because I like the way it's unifying the edges, but I don't want it to be too strong. And then one thing I think that also really works with this is the palette. The palette is incredibly unified, and to get a similar feeling but with the colorfulness that you're going for is to get something that's more of a maybe like an analogous color scheme would do it. So I'm going to use an overlay layer because to my mind it's the quickest way of getting to an analogous color scheme, and we'll go with kind of a yellow orange here. And we don't have to go all the way with it. Maybe we can keep it a little bit softer, but I think that will allow us to get closer. You could likewise just diminish some of the saturations of some of these colors, like maybe the greens move a little bit more towards a yellow, and then some of these browns move towards grays or something like that. But to my mind, this is kind of the easiest way to push that. And then of course, if you didn't like this particular brand of color, you could easily switch it out for something else that maybe hits the emotional tone you were going for more specifically on this piece. Maybe you want it to feel like an overcast day or whatever, and that'll give you that ability. So anyway, I'll go over to the chat now and see if there are questions as it relates to this piece. So see if there are any questions. So looks like, so the brush that I'm using for this piece, it's a palette knife, and you can get it on my on a brush set. Just if you look on my website, or also on my old blog, if you just type in Sam Nielsen CS6 brushes into the Google search engine, it will turn it up for you so that you can find it. It should be the first link. So let me see if there's any questions. So how do I pick the shadow colors? This is a great question. In this case, I was going for something that was a more diffused light coming from overhead. And so I was going with warmer. That said, and I think like in this case, it gets like super, almost like it's a late evening thing. But one thing that's missing in all of these cases that I think I would definitely want in there is the sky. So even if the light is bouncing off a building up there and coming down, we're going to have a little bit of cool color coming from the sky that I would expect to happen as a sort of transitional thing in the shadows. So really the shadow color is going to come down to what the light is and how the light fills in those areas. So I'm not going to probably spend a lot of time doing this, but if you just put a touch of cool in the transition out of those shadows and then goes back to warm again, then you'll get this feeling of the sky having this sort of like, radiant warm color, but then you have the cools that happen from the blues in the sky. And of course that will also pick up and turn into grays when you do this overlay layer. All right, so let's see if there's any other questions on this. So shadow accuracy tends to be really important, in particular with environment. So the question was, how much does shadow accuracy contribute to a piece? And I think like matching the shadows to what the lighting is supposed to be doing in that scene is like how soft it is, the temperature, stuff like that. I would say you always want to get reference of good lighting conditions. I did this out of my head, but typically you shouldn't be working out of your head unless you've done 1,000 pieces like this before. Always get some reference in front of your eyes. Composition is always on a higher importance than anything else. That was the other half of that question. So yes, composition is always the most important thing. So if this is part of a movie, would you follow the color script is a good question. Yes, I would. And you should always follow the color script as they've put it. So there's a question about integrating things from the beginning, because you can pull all the light together at the end like I did, or you can just start out the piece and kind of know where you're going from the first place. And I found what I said earlier about finding reference is especially important for that. I know I said it once, I'll say it twice, I'll say it 100 times. Get really good reference. Get reference for the types of textures you're getting there. Also get reference for the lighting conditions. And when you combine that stuff together, you're going to get a better and much closer to what you need to do. So this says, would this make a good piece for background design or background color? And obviously I was very rough here. I think this is probably more like a color key in terms of quality the way I did it. The original is probably going to work fine for a background design because the edges are a bit more tight. Unless the style of the show leans this direction, typically you're going to have a hard time getting that rough with your brush strokes and everything. So yeah, and let's show you guys in black and white. That was the last question. Always use grayscale when you're trying to look at stuff in black and white, because if you just do a saturation shift then you don't necessarily get accurate colors. You get some of your reds and some of your blues do some kind of weird things. They'll get brighter than what you want them to be. So anyway, that's the value scheme as it relates to the scene. We'll take one last question. Do you think that adding any strong contrast to this piece would vastly change the mood, or do you think it looks better as a unified piece? So strong contrasts really come down to focal point. And I'm going to talk about that in some of the upcoming critiques in a minute. But for me right now, the focal point is all about these things. To me, this is a path composition in this piece. We kind of bounce around and follow these plants, and that becomes kind of the main focal point. And as we kind of move around through those focal points, we see the door that sits at the center. That's what a frame composition is meant to do. So path composition is about leading people along, and a frame composition is about having people kind of see what's going on in the middle of what's going on. But we didn't really talk about focal point in this one, and I think that would be a question you'd want to ask at the beginning instead of at the end like I just did. All right, so let's move on to the next critique. All right, Mara, I don't know how to pronounce people's names, and I apologize if I'm messing these up, but I'm going to go in here with, and we're going to talk a little bit about composition. So I'm going to use kind of a flatter brush, something that doesn't have as much texture to it, so we can just focus on the composition here. And for me, this image is all about focal point. It feels like the main focal point of this piece is supposed to be this character, and yet my eye is being kind of perpetually pulled off by these other things. One of the best ways to work out a focal point is going to be to do a luminosity layer, because it doesn't kill any of your colors, but it lets you control what's going on a little bit better. So for example, if I use luminosity on these characters in the background, then I can actually bring their values together without changing any of the colors as you've done in this piece. And now you'll notice that this foreground character kind of becomes the focal point right here, and then all the other stuff becomes this kind of supporting role in comparison. And of course we can turn that down a little bit because we don't need to wipe those characters out entirely. We just don't want them to be drawing attention away too much. We just want them to be there and not necessarily killing things. Another thing that I use a lot for controlling composition is darken layers. So in this case, I think I want to get rid of some of the high contrast stuff that's going around this area. So I'm going to use a gray darken layer, and then we'll bring it up through the warms in gradient as we go up out of that area. So it feels like the cloud isn't necessarily changing temperature, but what the darken layer does is it doesn't touch any of the darker values, but it pulls those lighter values down, so that once again we can bring the attention back to this character. Shadows are also a really effective way of controlling things. So right now you've got a shadow coming off this way from the bush, then you've got all this really complicated stuff here. I kind of think, again, using a darken layer, you can probably just pull all that stuff together using a single shadow, and it'll fix the whole thing. I would probably either lighten this stuff up here or bring it all down in value, but honestly I think this is working way better now, just in terms of how it pulls my attention to that character. And interestingly, this is the main focal point in the piece, and by softening these characters we have actually increased the interest in that central focal point. Even though we've also strengthened this one, we've strengthened the center as well, and it's mostly because these were kind of encroaching that middle territory between these two characters. Now these characters I think can be pretty important as well, but I would want their values to be a little more unified overall. So I think they can probably have the harder, stronger edges against that background, but maybe they should be a little closer together in terms of values. So I'm essentially just bringing all those local values down so they sit in about the same territory. And I'm doing this on a layer that's at 45%. Honestly, I think with these characters you could drop it even further. Let's just do that. So I'll do a luminosity layer that just really bottoms out those values. And what it does is you get all the colors and all the cool stuff that you have going on around the rims and all the nice local color things that you have going on. None of that stuff goes away, but these characters are now no longer becoming primary focal points. And so they become kind of a singular shape here. Going back to what I was doing before, I'd probably just brighten this stuff up so that we're not drawing attention away with the stuff on the side of that tree. All right, so then the other thing, in addition to kind of pushing the focal points on this one, is I think you could really make this seem so much more epic by adding a touch more atmosphere. Right now you've got these really nice atmospheric effects happening with the clouds as they wrap off of this character, and it does help increase the scale of that character, but I can't help but feel like, in fact, let me just show you real quick what happens if I turn this image to grayscale, because then you'll see what it is that I'm trying to go for. So you can see that this character is actually the same darkness, the shadows are the same value as these foreground characters. And you should never really have that with a large character that's at a distance. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually use a lighten layer here, because lighten layers are awesome with atmosphere, and we're going to lift this character into the background a little bit. And I don't know exactly what local color or shadow color I want to do here, so I'm just going to lift everything back there kind of at the same time. And you want to make sure that this isn't just happening on the character. You want to make sure that it's happening with these clouds, the mountains, the trees in the background, just anything that's sitting way back there should be affected by that atmosphere. And this doesn't appear to be affecting everything equally, so what I'm going to do is brighten the whole thing and adjust the colors. Which may mess up with some of the edges that I thought were all nicely painted. Now I realize that they're dumb. But I can fix them very easily. And then I'm going to maybe roll this a little bit warmer. I think the color that I've got isn't quite working with your scene, and maybe that one works a little better. And at this point I'm just going to turn that value down so that we get the sense of the atmosphere, we get the values collapsing together, but we just want enough for that character to stick in the background. Although I think it's okay in this case to really push some of the farther background stuff back. What I'm going to do here is maybe select around this head. I was trying to use my Cintiq, but my cursor's offset. I reinstalled drivers today and it messed everything up. One thing I'll do in Photoshop a lot is I'll push something all the way, and then I'll use the fade function, which is Command-Shift-F. And so I can drop that back to like 50% of what I had. And it'll allow me to really control some of these atmospheric effects. You can also get to that here, so fade is right there. So anyway, that's where I would go with this one, just so you can see against the final, against the original, and then I'll go again to kind of get questions from people. So there's a question about any suggestions with the direction in pieces. I know you have to lead the eye, but sometimes things don't flow as well. How might one counter that without making it too forcefully directional? When you're talking about directional, I'm not sure specifically you mean like flows and movements as they go through a piece, like everything is kind of leaning one direction or whatever. And then I think if that's the case, then the thing that breaks that direction is going to become a compositional hot point. Whether you like it or not. And then if you're talking about flows in terms of like how the compositional points kind of move around, I always like to think in terms of simple shapes. I found that the best way to do that is to say, here's a compositional hot point, there's a compositional hot point, there's a compositional hot point, there's a compositional hot point. The pointing finger and looking eyes are always compositional hot points, so they draw us across. And then, of course, we got, in this case, it's actually more this, but we are getting for sure the contrast against that edge. There's a compositional principle called the law of proximity, which is that when you have a bunch of blank stuff around the edges of something, that even low contrast stuff is going to stand out strongly in the same way that high contrast stuff would, just because that extra space draws our eye to it. Anyway, so that's kind of the compositional flow in this, and I think it works well enough. It feels like it kind of follows a relatively simple shape. But if you're running to a place where things are getting too complicated, I'd say trace out that shape and see if there's a simpler way to move the eye through the piece. Okay, so another question, would you take away some of the characters for compositional purposes? I don't see any reason why you would need to here, but a lot of the time what I would do is, instead of taking away characters, is I would group them together. When for example, if these two characters were much closer to each other, we would then read them as a crowd instead of individual characters. We'd see them as kind of a group. And so that's kind of what this is doing. I mean, there is the gap in between, which I don't know if it's necessary. You could probably pull these characters a little closer to each other also, and then they read as a single unit instead of as such separate things. We're so good at picking out people and characters from a piece, animals, whatever else. You don't really need to worry about if we can tell that there are two people there. So you just squish them up next to each other. We'll figure it out just fine. So somebody says, is flow an absolute necessity in all pieces? No, it is not, but I've found flow to be an invaluable tool in controlling both compositional movement and also to allow you to introduce chaos into a design. So flow essentially makes it so that our eyes see everything as being related. And one of the problems when you're trying to do very complicated designs is that we get confused. Our eyes have a hard time kind of sorting out all this stuff. So flow is a way of kind of getting our eyes to relax and then getting us to kind of focus on the things that really matter. So last question, then we'll actually we can take a couple questions here, I think. Is simplifying the composition to support the focal point a movie making approach, since a read must be quick, or is it an important principle in all image making? So I would say it's an important principle in all image making. I think how complicated your compositional path is going to depend on how long the person is going to be looking at an image. If you have something that's going to be showing in an art gallery where somebody can stand in front of it for 3 hours, a really complicated composition can be great because it draws people in and allows them to kind of weave around and find all sorts of interesting things. For a comic book, that people can look at it a while, but you don't want to confuse the panels from each other, and you do want people to read, kind of get the emotional impact fairly quickly. So a composition in a comic book is naturally going to be faster than what you'd see in an art gallery. For a television show, it's super fast. Like that image might be on the screen for a couple seconds at most, and you don't want the audience to be reeling for 3 seconds trying to understand everything that they're seeing. So in that case, it goes super fast. Let's see. If you're doing a complex illustration like this in traditional media, would you do this atmosphere and directing in a value study? For sure. Yeah, I would always, if I was doing traditional media, I would do like 5 different studies before I started in the final thing. I would honestly do digital studies first before going in, because digital is so much faster, and then the traditional would be how you get kind of like the nice artifacts and everything that come with that. Okay, last question. I think that little of texture was not so necessary on the monster. What do you think? So you're asking if like this texture is too much. Or are you talking if maybe we needed more texture? I think the amount of texture for this scene, for this style, seems fine. I think the amount of contrast in the texture as it gets back here in the neck might be a bit much. So in other words, I think the shadows are probably fine, but I'd probably drop some of these highlights on the individual texture pieces, just focus on the larger forms. So that's how I would see with that. All right, we now have to move on to the next critique. Let's see. Oh, I got out of order. I just realized I got out of order. So sorry, Zainab. You had to wait for 15 minutes longer so that I could get here to your critique. All right, so let's talk about this one and this one and this one. I think they both suffer from the same problem. And I mentioned this earlier in this critique, but if you zoom way out, can you still tell what's going on? Now I can tell in this case that there's a little character down here, but my eye actually has a hard time reading what's going on up above. And there's a couple things that are contributing to that. One is the even split compositionally. You generally want to avoid that. Moving this off from center keeps it from becoming a single unit and makes it much easier to tell what's going on. But the second thing is just the way the character pulls out of the background. It's kind of in this piece, the tail is the easiest and first thing to read. I think I'll just demonstrate what I do on this image. So this is same scenario I brought up earlier, where I'd actually do a luminosity layer. And what you need to decide on in here is a focal point. There's just too many things going on. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's too many elements in this image, but what's happening is that there's too many things that are interesting to look at. And so what I'm going to do to supplement that is I'm going to try and make it so that this character becomes the focal point. And again, like the previous image, I'm going to start by using the luminosity layer. Luminosity layer, if you've already spent all of your hours rendering and picking colors and doing amazing things with those colors, then that color or that layer type is going to save your life. But if you're early on in the painting or you're still in the middle of the painting process, then you can also often get away with lighten and darken layers to kind of control the composition on this in similar ways. Now in this case, I'm not drawn especially to this cactus on the side, and there's a bit of a spacing thing going on with that in the other character that I think should make it work fine. I'm going to swap out brushes here though for something a little softer. So these foreground elements is as long as they kind of read as a single unit, they should be fine. Although honestly, I looked at this image like 20 times before I brought it up for this critique, but now that I see it, I just realized that I hadn't seen it any of those times. So one of the things you might want to do with the atmosphere is just kind of push that thing so that it is reading in silhouette as well. Oh man, we lost the canvas again. So I'm pushing all this stuff to the background. Now in the end, I'm probably not going to have all this stuff be pushed to the background this much, but in a way it's kind of nicer to control all this stuff so completely in the beginning and then back off where it's necessary to really make it work. And I think I may let some of these mountains go even farther back from what I did. All right, so now we have a focal point, this character that sits right in the middle. And there's a lot of like fine tuning we could do with that composition, but I think we're getting what we need, and now we can turn that layer down until we feel like we're getting kind of the flavor or feeling of the original piece. I think we could probably go back to like 50% of what it is and then erase out for specific objects. So maybe I'll keep all this stuff up, but I'm going to make it so that these objects here, oh, that was not the brush that I thought it was. Eraser, that's what I meant. So I might make it so that this stuff kind of pulls to the foreground a little bit more. I'm going to use that fade function to kind of control where those values go a little more. But In some ways, it's like this thumb is creating a tangent with this pole, and so we may need to just either move that out of the way entirely, or keep it really knocked back with the atmosphere. But because of the thickness of it, it looks like it's just another one of these telephone poles, and it should be closer to us. You can do localized atmosphere, meaning stuff that is grouped in a specific area. It just might be weird in this case to push that idea too much. So then we got foreground stuff again. Anyway, I didn't mean to spend too much time on this one. I just wanted to show some of the stuff that I talked about on the previous to really push this idea of the composition. But I wanted to get to this image right here. And I think these two actually suffer from very similar problems in that they're lacking a punchiness. So the punchiness of these designs is what's missing. And Craig Mullins always talks about when you're painting that it's all about getting the correct shape and the correct color. Correct color meaning hue, saturation, and value together. And once you get those things, you should be able to get punchiness. And so fundamentally, your image, the structure of your image should give us some of that punchiness. Now, this one I think has real potential to give some punchiness. And this is going to be true. Like the previous one, we were kind of focusing on the composition, but all of these, the same rules could kind of apply. Is that where you said that you wanted to go into illustration, and illustrations are, it is all about that punchiness. What is it that draws you to that thing on the page? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to focus on elements that are going to bring us into this page. And first thing I'm going to do is shift the color in this hair and try to control the lighting and movement of the color on the side. You may introduce a rim light or a soft kind of kick light later, but for now I think just something really simple that allows us to get that punchiness that I'm asking for on it, or suggesting that maybe you need. I think with these, the color maybe needs a little bit more of the greens that we're getting, and I'd say just keep those values a little flatter. You don't want to over model shadows. Over modeling means that you've got too wide of a value range, and you don't want to have too wide of a value range when you're getting into the shadow areas. Now, I think the face, I feel like we need to find the punchiness there, and I think the punchiness is going to come 100% from those eyes. And so my instincts tell me to merge together the shapes of the cheeks and nose a little bit more. You can still have some of the definition that you're getting, but maybe it just needs to be a little flatter overall. And then of course that brow. And I'm going to add a touch of shadow up here as well. Again, the purpose here being the punchiness, and I think framing this face with some really nice reds and oranges is going to help increase that punchiness quite a bit. I know it's a weird term, punchiness, but a good way to describe this is just the initial impact that the piece has, the thing that makes you want to lean in and say, oh, that's nice, I want to look at it a little bit more. And so finding the right shape for this shoulder, something that kind of blends some of that value together, is going to help with that punchiness. You can still get those sort of like scrapes or gill things that you had. I think those are fine, but you'll notice that most of the stuff I'm focusing on here is all about the shapes and how the shapes kind of control the way that we feel about that image. Gradients are nice, and you'll sometimes use them when there's no other choice, but when you can get the niceness of the image to come across just from really interesting shapes, your pieces are just going to get so much better from that. Okay, then another element of punchiness that I think is going to help this a lot, although let me really quickly blend some of that arm. It's like I said, gradients are sometimes necessary. The other element of punchiness that I think will help here is trying to pull the character's values off of the background. And I think in this case, you could go with something where the character is really blending into the background and the punchiness is coming more from the hair and the green shapes that are going against that background. But in honor of kind of the decisions you've already made in this piece, what I'm going to do is just try to make so this character has a little bit more of that punchiness without changing so much the stuff that you've already done. So in this case, what I'm going to do is a levels. So levels is like curves. So you could do this with curves, but levels is just like the simple, it's the, you know, poor man's level. I mean, it's the poor man's curves. And basically what I can do here is I can push this until we kind of get some values in that head that are a little bit stronger. Now, we're not getting a ton of value range out of that I think is going to be useful. So what we may have to do is darken the background color a little bit to get the punchiness in the face that we're looking for. So in addition to that, I might do just an overall brightness change against that background. And what that I'll do is allow that face to just kind of pop out of that overall shadowy flavor that we have going on. All right, so then the other thing, and this is something I think a lot of people struggle with, is that your edges are kind of hurting your images. And most people worry a lot about edges, and I'd say like the edges should really be the last thing. But when you're working with edges, I found, at least for me personally, that you want to have the strongest edges where your focal points are, and then you're kind of moving on and off through the rest of the image. So for example, you might just kind of blend out the base of that hair. I mean the tips of that hair, just let them die out a little bit. And then you can exchange the values here. So we have maybe a sharper value or a sharper edge right there, and then we can kind of let it die out right next to it. There isn't really a rule on like when you can and can't do that. Some people have tried to create rule sets, but the reality is that it's all up to you and what you want to say in your painting, where you want the attention to go. I mean, the rule of thumb is that generally the light areas are going to be sharper and the shadow areas are going to be a little bit more blended. But you can break that rule. There's no reason why you have to stick to that rule. In a lot of ways, rules are crutches, and crutches are useful if you're limping along, but they're not useful once you want to, now have full freedom to run. So you got to understand that the rules are only going to take you so far, and then there's a point at which you got to kind of take those crutches off and step out on your own and figure out what you want to do. And so some of the areas that are bothering the most as far as like edges go, or like the tip of the tail here, it's just like it's so sharp. Every single part is sharp, and I just want it to calm down a little bit, not be everything so important. I might even use some lost edges. So the difference between soft edges and lost edges is that lost edges are changed by values, whereas soft edges are changed by blending. And so in this case, I'm going to go with lost edges instead. Using a lighten layer, I'm going to just lighten up this tail and make it so that it just changes local color near the tip there. And maybe it shouldn't do the same thing everywhere. I think you can decide how much you want to control this, but that's kind of a quick way to essentially control a lot of the edges very, I guess, like together. I don't know why it is, but once I got a bunch of people watching, my mental thesaurus just stops working. It's a problem with going live on stuff. So yeah, like this super crisp edge all the way down. I don't mind that there's a crisp edge there, but I just kind of wonder, could you go a little softer with that and just let it die out a little bit near the bottom? Same thing with this arm here. Does it really need to be quite so strong everywhere? Can you let some of those things just kind of get a little bit more energy in them? All right, we better do a quick question and answer because I kind of went over with this, but let's copy and paste this over the original so that you can see why I made the decisions that I did. And now we got an illustration that just really pops off the page. Okay, so any questions? Let's see. Somebody says, is it possible to send in some artwork? And yeah, you can go to my Instagram. There's a post there that you can uh, tag. I talked about that at the beginning, and maybe I'll show it again at the end. And I'll probably do a couple more of these, although I don't think I'm going to do a big session like this. They'll probably be more one-on-one. Change by blending means like a smudge tool, right? Like if you were to take your hand and like drag something, or you have a paintbrush on wet canvas and you kind of blend it there. That's what I meant by change by blending. So, so yeah, blending via color, blending via layer styles. I'm not sure what you mean by layer styles, but I think what I was talking about specifically was blending via like a smudge tool, right? If I take this smudge tool and I go in here and I just kind of soften this shoulder out a little bit, then we get something a little bit interesting there, and we don't have the sharp edge showing up everywhere. And it just helps things out. Ooh, here's another place where we could soften that edge and do something really nice. Don't need to do it everywhere, and we don't necessarily want to use a smudge tool too much. I prefer to use brushes a little bit more, because smudge tools tend to get really, really soft. And sometimes it starts to get this sort of like airbrushed, I don't know, like ugly wetness to it. So you want to really control where that smudging is happening. Okay, any last questions before we move on to the last one? Or not the last one, second to last one. We got just a couple more critiques here. Okay, improving the posture was the other question there. Uh, Honestly, for me, the weirdest thing here is the hard change in the mermaid. It's like if you're imagining like the mermaid tail has like bones in it, then this totally makes sense. But I kind of think you should take care of the mermaidiness, or suggest some kind of movement there. I think like the arms and hands are interesting. They're a little bit awkward, but I like the awkwardness. Like she's not used to being on land. Um, it's like I never really like a head that's straight up and down. I think that might be the other thing I would target next is like, can you tilt the head a little bit one direction or the other to increase the pose or the niceness of the pose. Okay, so we'll move on now to this one. All right, Austin. So you said that you want to go into games, and I get a sense as to like what type of games you want to go into based on what I'm seeing here. But my overall impression looking at this stuff is that you are understanding the form of what makes a game design work, but you're not understanding the purpose. So what game design is all about, what character design in games is all about, is communicating to the viewer what that character is going to do, and how their story relates to essentially what they're going to do, how they're going to affect things. I know there's NPCs that don't do anything and stuff like that, but these characters all look like they're supposed to do something. And so when I look at this stuff, I get the feeling, like I said, that we're getting like these really cool kind of like zigzaggy sort of shapes. I get these really spiky armor sorts of things, but I don't know why. And that's really the big question with this character: is why did you make all the decisions that you did? And obviously, we can't have a conversation right now that much about it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to deduce a couple things based on what I'm seeing here, and we're going to adjust some of the shapes from what I am seeing here. So we'll kind of come up with our own story of this character. So this character feels like he's kind of like a big bad, dark overlord sort of thing. He's got this big, long, regal neck thing. He's got all the gold going on there, the big cape, and then of course this feels like it's part scepter, part weapon, and so I'm really getting this sort of like kingly vibe out of this character. But then when I look at like all the individual decisions that are being made with that, I'm not really getting a sense as to like what type of king. I mean, he looks bad, like he looks like he's gonna be a bad guy. Sometimes when you get like really kind of twisty with those shapes, those twisty sort of spike shapes, it's just like we look at that stuff and just like, yeah, that has to be a bad guy. It's like a blade claw or whatever, and you're using that motif all over the place here. So what I'll do here is we'll just redraw this guy's silhouette according to what I'm seeing. I really like some of the regalness that's going on in the set of the head, so we'll try and keep that the same. I kind of feel like this character needs another symbol that kind of pushes the idea of the regality of the character. Another thing that I would say, and this we don't know exactly what you had in mind here, but you should always try to understand what the audience is. So, is this for like 13 to 15-year-old boys? I don't know if you can even read those letters. That was crazy. So like if you know the age range of the thing, then I think that gives you a lot more choices. When I look at this and I look at the armor, this feels way more like way less like something realistic and like you might see in a game that's trying to give us like these very true to life presentations of the characters, and more like something that's just trying to give us this over the top crazy universe. And one of the things that I see when I look at that and think about this being an over the top crazy universe is I want crazier proportions to go with that over the top craziness. So I'm also thinking about the kingly thing, and something that symbolically works really well. The diamond is kind of this a shape that has this natural regality to it, and it also interestingly also have a sense of danger to it. So I'm just gonna push a little bit that feeling, and I might even reintroduce that motif in a couple different areas. I think I'll go with slightly larger forearms here because it seems like you're emphasizing the forearms, but you're not emphasizing them enough for the kind of crazy style that I think you might want to go for, given at least the decisions you made on the armor, because these are definitely not practical for movement. It's mostly just for looking super crazy, right? So I'm doing a lot of big silhouette breaks to kind of go with what you're doing. One thing I would watch out for is to make sure that the silhouette breaks mean something. So anytime that you're going to break the silhouette of the character in a big way, like this little skirt thing or that belt, it should feel like it's saying something, it's adding something. Like in this case, I kind of feel like there's this sense of like utility, or it's not a belt that's meant to hold up his pants. It's a belt that's made to give him a sense of movement. Maybe he stores stuff in there or whatever. Um, and then this sort of like these, I don't even know the names of armor. I've looked it all up before and I can't remember any of this stuff. It's kind of this loincloth thing that goes across there. These have this sort of like regal vibe to them. I'm going to connect that shape together so it's taking that diamond and recreating it again. And then I'm going to try to take these legs, and since we're trying to push for a regal vibe on this guy, or at least I'm trying to push for a regal vibe, who knows what you're going for. This is what I'm doing, and it's my critique, so I decide. We're going to push the legs a bit longer and just make it so this character feels like crazy tall. Getting a little bit more of that. This is the God King that rules everybody with the iron fist, or I guess in this case it looks more like a silk glove. I'd say with those hands, I would probably go a little bit more bold with it. Again, it's like with video games, you're always going for what is it that you want the impression to give? What do you want us to say or to think that this character is doing? And the action that this character is going to create or perform. And if this character is supposed to be like a warrior king or something, I want those hands to feel like they're effective at something. You can still get away with the sort of like tapered, delicate, kingly fingers, but I think the hands overall just need to be a little bit more beefy for this. I like some of what you're doing with the armor here, but I'm going to try and bring it into that diamond sweep that I was using. And maybe since we're going with crazy proportions here, we're going to let those shoulder pads go out like 3 times farther than is practical. We can still get away with the little like flip up armor here, but I'm thinking like maybe it shouldn't break the silhouette so much that we lose that triangle. That diamond. And again, maybe the larger hand here. Because this character is so complex, I would probably pull this weapon a little bit more off of the silhouette of the character, so we're just bringing it far enough away that we can read what's going on there. And then I really like this cape, but same issue here. I'd say maybe that cape thing needs to be doing something, or sweeping across the background in such a way that we're not losing that first read of the character, or we're not losing the armor. I don't know if the cape is connecting up here at his belt. If it connects up even farther, you could do something even more with it. Like trying to undo here, and I drew a million strokes there. I don't know how I did that in 2 seconds. Anyway, so yeah, it's like that cape could, if it's coming from higher up, actually you could even do it from here. You can make so that cape from down here waves off to the side, blowing in the wind crazily, because that's something that's going to happen a lot in games. This character moves around, that cape kind of picks up the dynamics, assuming that he's not just sitting on a throne all day. So then, once I've done all that, I would take a step back and say, all right, is this character giving me the impression that I want? Is it actually communicating the stuff that we want it to communicate? And I think I'm getting definitely the regal warrior vibes. I think if you wanted it to read as a king, you might take that stuff that you were doing in the hair and maybe just jut it up a tiny bit more in one or two places. I think just to give us that crown vibe. Like, don't be afraid of breaking that silhouette. Generally, if you're doing film work, you don't want to be breaking the silhouette too much. But if you're doing games work, breaking the silhouette is good if you make each silhouette change matter. So in this case, it's like, that silhouette change, it brings back, some of this like triangular diamond feeling, but it also kind of connects with the shapes we've got below. But it also has this sort of like thorny component, which I think if we got rid of it, we would feel like we are missing it a tiny bit. So actually, that would be a good recommendation that I'd give is as you dive in to do this sort of work, make sure that as you're questioning each of these things, see what it looks like without it. If you pull that little thing out, does it change the feeling in a fundamental way? Does it ruin the design? If we get rid of that up there, does it make the design worse? And I kind of like what those adjustments make. They're not convoluting things. I do wonder about and question that little extra thing. Maybe we can get away with something that is not creating so much visual noise there. And that's really, when it comes to those silhouette changes, the reason why you can be bold with them for games, but when you put them in, they have to matter, because every single one adds visual noise and makes it a little bit harder to read that character, and that's why they have to matter. So the breaking the silhouette in film is a good question. Sorry, let's go to Q&A now. So breaking the silhouette in film is more of an issue of how quick the character is on screen. Usually a director wants the character to pop up on the screen, and they almost immediately are able to tell what type of character that is, what's going on, and they want to draw the attention usually towards the face or towards the action being performed. Every silhouette break draws attention. In a video game, you have a lot of time to look at a character and how they move and kind of get a sense of them. Whereas in a film or a television show, you're generally backing off on that. I mean, you'll notice that even in, like, look at the comics versions of the Marvel characters, and then look at the film versions and look at how they've kind of streamlined those silhouettes to make it work for film. It doesn't mean that you can't break the silhouette. It just means, like what I was saying here with the silhouettes, every silhouette change having to matter, that redoubles again and again when you're talking about film or TV work. With TV work, honestly, the biggest thing is the expense of production. So usually when you're creating extra silhouette breaks in TV work, it's going to be bringing that idea in as well, because you do get to spend a lot more time with the characters in TV. All right, so how do you handle silhouette on a character with very long hair? Great question. So let's give this character very long hair. So it does tend to obscure the character when you kind of go crazy with that. The hair, I think, like, we could potentially make a silhouette that tells us that that's hair, and that would be totally fine. We could even break off individual strands or something crazy. There we go. This guy's got beautiful, like, Dr. Seuss hair. But yeah, I'd say, like, you don't necessarily need to read the profile of the character or the shape of the head, but you do have to be able to tell who the character is and be able to tell from a distance. Now, another thing about silhouette on characters is that in game characters in particular is you have to be able to recognize them from a distance. And so usually your silhouette adjustments are very, very bold. You're making big, big, big decisions so that when that character in that 35 or 50 millimeter camera is clear across the level, you can tell which character it is and what it's going to do to mess you up. So when it comes to like, the hair and how that stuff works, you really just need to be able to recognize the character and tell what they are from a distance if you're talking about games. Um, is your previous talk applying character design principles to anything going to be available? You can actually access it in the I forget what it was. There's a Discord channel where they're posting talks that were broken, and even though it wasn't broken, you can get to it. Question. So would you say it's always important to have a big overall shape in your character design, like what you did with the diamond shape? I like to have a motif that means something and then repeat that motif around. Shape language is very important. It's something that works very subtly. Humans just make connections with certain shapes. Some have more of a cultural significance, but there's ones like, triangles always having a danger to them, squares and rectangles feeling very rigid, stuff like that is going to be universally true. So I am always using shape language, and I'll try to come up with shapes that have meaning, and then I'll repeat them so the character feels unified across. We probably need to go on to the last critique here, but I'll try to come back to some of these questions. So if you wanted to go for a style with entirely hard edges, that's a really good one that we probably should address real quick. Because I think like when you have a style that's got a lot of hard edges and you're trying to control like how the silhouette and everything is going in it, one of the things you got to do is you got to identify where the hard edges are really needed as dictated by that style, because every style has some way of achieving curves. Even if you do a completely faceted style, you can actually move the facets together in such a way that you create something that feels more like a curve, and then you're just kind of tightening things up and getting the more creased stuff in the places where you need it, and then moving to the rounded or rounded facets everywhere else. Style is hard. That's a whole discussion all by itself that we probably can't get into too far here. All right. Okay, last one is Tadhus, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right, and I'm sorry if I didn't. That's what happens when we talk only online. But you said that you were going with this stuff, and in particular, like some of your newer stuff, for more of like an adult look, so millennials and everything. And I just wanted to point out that when I look at this stuff, this feels like super Zootopia to me. Like this is not an adult property. It feels like something that like if you tried to sell this to adults, it's got to be like crazy sarcastic or like funny in such a way that it's almost making fun of the Disney thing, because most people will assume that it's not really for them if it goes in this style. When we go to this, and let's talk about this page a bit, but this kind of has a similar problem in my mind where it's like if you're going for an older audience, 18 into the 30s range, there's two things that you can really get away with in that group. One is going for nostalgia a little bit, although you won't get a primary audience through nostalgia, but you'll sometimes get a secondary audience through nostalgia. The other thing is going to be something that really has a little bit of that like adult edginess to it. And so yeah, when I look at this story right here of like this girl and this monkey, one of the things that I would address almost immediately with it is to try to push the proportions in such a way that it feels like it's got a little bit more of an adult vibe. I'd say look at some of the M-rated stuff, or the I guess it's M-rated or TVMA or whatever. I guess it's different in every country, the rating system, but the adult animated stuff that you see, like Love, Death and Robots, look at that stuff. Look at what they did to kind of signal to the audiences that this stuff is for adults, because that's something that I'm feeling primarily when I look at this stuff, is that it's not really reading yet as what you're saying that it should read for. So what I'm going to do is, rather than redesign this for adults, although I might look for a couple of suggestions for that, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this page and we're going to talk a little bit about a principle of character design that I think is really important. And that principle is the so what of a design. In fact, this could probably go to some of the other design stuff that we've talked about during this critique session, which is really all about why should anybody care about your design? Why should they want to know about this turtle monkey amphibious thing? And you really need to be dialing in, no matter what type of design work you're doing, you should be thinking about so what? Why should anybody care? And when I say so why should anybody care, a lot of the time people's reaction is something like, well, I care, and I show it to all of my artist friends and they care. But especially where you were talking about the audience that you want this stuff to appeal to is a very broad kind of mainstream audience. That broad mainstream audience, they don't care about this stuff. They don't care about how nice a drawing is. They don't care about how well, proportioned the face is. What they care about is whether they identify with the character. And so really that's what these designs are going to come down to is, do I identify personally with this character? Does this character feel like someone that I know or that resonates on that human level? Now, I think you've got some stuff that is really working that way. Like you've got these great human eyes. So, and these kind of sympathetic sort of shapes that you've got in the eyes, the way that the hair kind of drizzles across the face in a lot of these, and that they're cute characters. I think those are all pretty effective things. The stuff that I think is more confusing is this stuff, right? We have the amphibious thing and we've got the turtle shell thing. Now there are niche audiences that are going to say like, oh man, cool, that's great. But generally with a mainstream audience, you're looking for something that connects with them on a personal level. So when I look at this, and I'm trying to think about how do you make this connect on a personal level, the first thing that I want to ask is why. When I look at these characters, which I think, they're all pretty effective. Maybe I'll spend time on this one because this is the one that I like the most. It's like this one has some great design stuff, but I like this one right here because this one is the closest one to connecting on a person, on a human level. Because there's something about the sort of puppy dog eyes of that character, the way that the muzzle is working and the mouth, that makes me feel bad for it. I want to take care of this character. Now, there's maybe too many flutters happening here in the mouth. You could probably ease those up a tiny bit. And I think maybe not too much smile there. We'll keep the character in the neutral state that you've got because I like the sort of sympathetic thing that you've got going on in those eyebrows. But I like in some of the others, there's this sort of droopy quality that I think you may want to pull in, like almost like this character just came out of the water. Get that kind of like wet dog feeling. I like the sort of thing popping back in the top of the head. I think that's pretty effective. But so for me, like personally, that face, if you introduce the sort of sympathetic element with that sympathetic face, for me, that one just like, I love that. With the body, I actually think the gesture also does a really good job there because I like this, the rope. It feels like somebody's been asking this character to do something to carry it around. It increases this sort of sympathetic, I feel bad for this character sort of thing. I would probably use slightly droopier lines in the body here, at least for this pose. Because where you're selling the sort of sad, the poor puppy sort of feeling, then you're going to be essentially wanting to push on some shape language that droops downward, which you've already got in the hands and in the arms. And I think I would just emphasize that with the body. With the amphibious elements, I mean, I think when it comes to this character, and the reason why I think this character resonated with me the most out of all of them is because it's not only that I felt bad for this character, is that I felt there's an awkwardness to this character. It feels like a character that doesn't feel like they fit in the world completely. We've got, the turtle shell and, the amphibious elements both feeling like these unnatural things on this monkey character. And so our first instinct is going to say, why? And then our second instinct is going to be, once we understand why, is, why does that mean something to me? And in this case, the thing that connects this design specifically to me, is that I'm like, well, he's kind of a monster, and I feel bad for a cute little monster that everybody's been mistreating. He's been, born this way or whatever. Now, that said, maybe, since we didn't really get a talk back and forth about this design, maybe the thing about this is you've created a world, like Avatar: The Last Airbender or something, where you have all sorts of crazy creatures, and that's normal. So first of all, that's a hard sell to audiences. You got to introduce the character, other characters, and then these kind of become ancillary characters after the fact, um, or they can be introduced as secondary or primary characters after the primary characters that we relate with more are introduced. But that said, I think in that world, once you've established the rules and you've said, like, do you know what, this is totally cool, what you would need to do to make this work in your portfolio is contextualize it. So if you have this character in a case like this, so here we've got a human and we've got a bunch of sort of animal things. And actually, these ones fit really well together. I look at those and I say, you know what, this is a world of animals that happens to also have humans in it. But then I'm like, what the heck? So this idea of, creating the strange thing, I think it's a great way to kind of alienate an audience. And if you want to alienate the audience, or you want them to say, like, what the heck, then that's perfect. But if you really want to make people love what you're doing and feel like it's really great, then let's see, where is it? Kappa's design, Kappa's friend. That's the one. So yeah, with this one, where you've got a human character and you've got this kind of weird monster monkey character, my assumption immediately contextualizing it like that is this is a world where things are mostly normal, but then we got this weird character in it. But if you can contextualize this character in such a way that, maybe there's other creatures that are, this kind of weird, like animal human hybrids, or, animal hybrids, I guess it wouldn't be animal human, get like, bird characters and whatever else. It's like, then it changes in your portfolio, in your pitch, whatever, the way that we feel about that. And people will kind of see. So I'm thinking about like the pitch meeting where you're standing in front of a bunch of executives, and they all have their arms crossed and they're like, I don't want to spend $100 million on this property or whatever it is. The way that you sell it to them is give them the entry point, and the entry point is going to be the human in this case. And you can introduce the other characters and all the weirdness of the world, but the human is going to be very important in this case. Not to say that you couldn't start out with a world that has animals, or where the animals are protagonists, especially if you're talking like a younger audience, as we were talking about before. But it's probably not going to be the weird monster turtle thing. You're going to want to find something that becomes that, essentially that insertion point, the thing that is going to allow that arms crossed executive to say, yep, I'm going to buy that thing. So obviously selling something in a pitch is much more complicated than that. That's a whole workshop by itself. But let's look and see if there's questions. Any questions from anybody? And by the way, with this one, I talked more conceptually about the design work because I think you've got really great draftsmanship. I think you've got awesome design sensibilities. I honestly am not even sure that I have that much to offer there. You're doing amazing work. And it's more about now, how do you connect what you're doing with your audience? And that's why I kind of talked the way that I did. All right, so let's look. So there's a question about how can we appeal to the wide audience. So what you have to look at is properties. So look at IPs, intellectual properties that have gone mainstream, and then try to analyze why they worked. Why was it that they went mainstream? Now, when we talk about mainstream, we're not just talking about that they got millions of dollars to be made. There's tons of stuff that gets millions of dollars to be made, but there's only a few things, a few properties that actually go big. And the properties that go big, the stuff that you get like tons and tons of people that are saying like, hey, I'm going to pull money out of my wallet to pay for this thing. You've got to analyze that stuff more than just the stuff that you like, because you might like a lot of things that are legitimately good, but that will never go mainstream or that aren't mainstream. And it's important to be able to designate or understand the difference between those things. And obviously, not everybody wants to go mainstream, right? The goals that you described to me for this portfolio and for these pieces, it sounded more like a mainstream audience, and that's why I kind of went that way. But if you want this to be some kind of weird niche thing and you have a very specific targeted audience and you know how to reach them and you can pitch that in the boardroom, awesome. But it's important to understand that audiences will like anything on social media. They'll just like love it to death. They might even buy print sometimes when you're getting into artist circles. But when you're asking people, everyday people, just random people off the street to give up their money for something that you've created, it totally changes the equation. And instead of becoming people that are like very generous in their praise, they become kind of like a turtle monkey that's retracted into its shell, and now you got to coax it out and say, no, 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 this is really cool, let me show you how, right? And you got to take them on that journey and show them why they should care. All right, let's see if there's any other questions. So what would be the top three books you'd recommend on values, light work? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know what books I could recommend. I'd have to think a little bit. James Gurney's books are really great, though. Um, Another question is a really good one. Should our whole portfolio be in one world? I've known people that have done that before. Make sure that the world is very diverse and that you can cover a lot of bases, and that should be fine. But it should not necessarily be. It's fine to have different properties. I find though when I do portfolio reviews and I see a bunch of stuff that's kind of from the same world or same property, it does tend to increase my interest in that thing rather than just being a bunch of random designs. So I think it's a good strategy to create sections of your portfolio that are dedicated to a certain IP, but it doesn't have to all be the same thing. The concept of over modeling, somebody asked me to explain it. So the concept of over modeling is just that, and I realize we're over time. You guys can check out if you're not interested anymore, but I'll keep talking for a couple more minutes. So if you're rendering something and you've got shadows, and the shadows have a certain amount of lighting, and we got like bounce light and whatever else in those shadows. I'm going to keep this all kind of unified in the same range. You've got bounce lights and stuff, and then you have a key light over the top of that. I guess I'll keep it in the blues. We'll keep it simple. So even if you rendered this so it was really, really nice, those shadows are going to be distracting. So over modeling means that you're using too wide of a value range in the shadows, and it makes your piece look worse. So I would say watch out for over modeling, just because it ends up making the shadow areas and the weird form changes there more important than what's going on in the light, which usually you put the light in places where you want to describe stuff. All right, so struggling with perspective drawing, any suggestion or referral of someone that explains those in depth? I would recommend Scott Robertson's How to Draw. Fantastic book. Go through every exercise in that book, and by the time you're done with that, you'll know how to draw in perspective and you'll be good at it. It's one of the best books I've ever seen on drawing instruction. So let's see, other questions. Okay, I think that's probably all. There's other questions up there, but I'm not going to scroll through everything. So anyway, I think we'll end here. Thanks everybody for showing up, and we'll see you later.